April 17th, 1961, they were told the beaches would be quiet, that the Cuban people would rise up, that air support was coming, but it wasn't. Instead, they were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, abandoned. In Miami, a mother clutched a photo of her son, waiting at the airport for a body that wasn't coming back. The government called it an invasion. The men who survived called it something else, a betrayal. The truth? It wasn't supposed to happen this way, but it did. There's an old saying that victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. And what the world never knew is how close that orphan came to starting World War III. Everyone remembers the image: young, polished, charismatic. John F. Kennedy wasn't just a president, he was America's golden boy. But here's the part they don't teach you. Within 90 days of taking office, JFK would greenlight a covert CIA invasion of Cuba, then cripple it mid operation, then lie about it to the American people, and in the process, get over 1,000 men captured, killed, or tortured. It started under Eisenhower, a secret CIA blueprint called a Program of Covert Action Against the Castro Regime, drafted in March of 1960, approved, funded, activated. It was everything America wasn't supposed to be: propaganda campaigns, sabotage missions, paramilitary training camps hidden in Guatemala. The plan was to make it look Cuban, just enough to fool the world. But it wasn't Cuban, not even close. It was CIA top to bottom, and everyone knew it. By the time Kennedy was sworn in, the operation was already moving. Planes were painted to look like defectors. Boats were loaded with weapons. Cuban exiles were training for a mission they believed would free their homeland. But Kennedy didn't trust the CIA. He thought the plan was reckless, sloppy, too big to hide and too small to win. And yet, he didn't stop it. Not because he believed in it, but because they boxed him in. The CIA, led by Allen Dulles, kept trimming the plan down. Smaller airstrikes, fewer troops, less visibility. They told Kennedy it could still work. They told him it would look like a homegrown uprising. They told him he'd never have to take responsibility. Behind closed doors, they told a different story. Internal CIA memos, now declassified, show it clearly. They expected the plan to trigger a full-blown crisis. They believed Kennedy would have no choice but to escalate. That once the mission started, he'd be forced to send in air support, then troops, then all in. They were staging a trap. But Kennedy didn't take the bait. Not fully. He authorized the invasion, but canceled the final wave of airstrikes. He wanted deniability. What he got was a damn disaster. The fighters landed, the world saw, and Kennedy blinked. He didn't kill the plan. He slow-walked it and let it bleed out on the beach. Before a single boat touched the shore, the invasion had already begun, not with bullets, but with stories. Because while Cuban exiles were training in Guatemala, another campaign was underway. One designed not to fight Castro, but to shape how we saw him. It started with a name: Radio Swan, a CIA-funded radio station beaming from a tiny Caribbean island. Officially, it was private. Unofficially, it was broadcasting anti-Castro propaganda, day and night, across Latin America. Songs, defector stories, false reports of internal uprisings, pre-written victory speeches, all aimed at convincing the world Cuba was about to collapse, and that the people were ready to rise up. But they weren't. And this wasn't just persuasion. It was a psyop. Declassified CIA memos show that Operation Mockingbird, the agency's covert program to infiltrate and influence the media, was fully operational. Reporters were recruited, editors were compromised, stories were planted. In Miami, local headlines began priming the public. Hints of an imminent revolution. Anonymous sources. Leaked stories of heroic defectors fleeing Castro's tyranny. It was a full-spectrum campaign, not to inform the public, but to prepare them. Because here's the twist. The PSYOP wasn't just aimed at Cuba, it was aimed at Kennedy. And the proof? Well, days before the invasion, Radio Swan broadcast an emergency call from inside Cuba. It said the people were rising up, that rebellion had begun, that the beachhead needed support. None of it was true, but the message was clear. We already started this, you better finish it. But guess what? Kennedy didn't. And when the airstrikes were canceled, the propaganda crumbled, revealing the truth beneath the myth. The CIA hadn't just prepared for an invasion. They had orchestrated the perception of inevitability. They didn't just want military victory. They wanted emotional consent. It was the war before the war, fought in headlines, radio waves, and whispers. And it worked, until it didn't. The CIA knew it wouldn't work. Not like this. Not without air cover. The entire plan, covert landings, beach assault, exiled Cuban fighters storming the shoreline, it only made sense if Castro's air force was taken out beforehand. No air superiority, no victory. And they knew that. But instead of telling Kennedy the truth, they told him a story. It was a sales pitch. Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, Jacob Esterline, the architects of the operation. They knew it needed real air support, but they believed Kennedy would blink when it counted. That once the invasion began, once Americans started dying, once radio stations lit up with calls for help, that he would panic and greenlight the full air campaign. But he didn't. Kennedy held the line. He didn't send the planes, and the men on the beach were left to die. Years later, CIA officer Grayston Lynch, the man who led the first amphibious assault at Playa Girón, said it flat out. He said the mission was doomed from the moment the second airstrike was canceled. That everyone at the CIA knew what it meant. Even Khrushchev saw it. In his private letters after the invasion, he mocked the failure. He said Kennedy had exposed himself as a weak and unfit for Cold War leadership. The CIA didn't just underestimate Castro. They didn't just overestimate the exiles. They overestimated Kennedy's willingness to lie and underestimated his fear of being exposed. They didn't just lie to the president. They banked on him breaking. April 17th, 1961. The boats landed just before dawn. Brigade 2506, some 1,500 Cuban exiles, hit the beach at Playa Girón, on the southern edge of the Bay of Pigs. They were armed, trained, motivated, but they were not ready for what waited for them. Because Castro knew. The first firefight started within minutes. Heavy machine gun fire pinned the brigade in the sand. Mortar shells tore through their boats, and Cuban Air Force jets dropped 250-pound bombs, obliterating supply lines before they could be established. The first wave held their ground. They were waiting for reinforcements, more boats, more ammo, and above all, air support. They had been told it was coming, and then it wasn't. At the last moment, Kennedy canceled the second airstrike. He was afraid the US would be exposed, afraid of Soviet retaliation, afraid the lie wouldn't hold. So he froze, and the CIA didn't push him. For 72 hours, the fighters on the ground held out. They ran out of food, out of ammo, out of radio contact. Some tried to swim back to sea. Others surrendered. Some were executed on the spot. The radio logs are gutting. You can hear the moment they realized no one was coming. The CIA had sent them in. The president had pulled the plug. And the world watched it collapse in real time. One by one, the voices on the radio went silent. The men on the beach weren't just outgunned, they were outmaneuvered by their own government. The invasion may have happened in Cuba, but the powder keg was lit in Miami. Because this wasn't just a group of exiles, it was a network, a shadow force of intelligence assets, paramilitary trainers, political operatives, and mobsters, all working toward one goal: taking down Castro. By 1961, South Florida wasn't just Little Havana, it was the front line. And watching it all, the Mafia. The Cuban-American mob boss Santo Traficante Jr., a key figure in Havana's pre-revolution casinos, had lost millions when Castro nationalized the island. So, he made a deal. Traficante partnered with the CIA to help fund anti-Castro operations. His reward? He'd get his Havana empire back once Castro was gone. And this wasn't hearsay. In 1977, the FBI declassified multiple files confirming Traficante's direct contact with CIA intermediaries and his involvement in at least 2 Castro assassination plots. At the same time, inside Miami's CIA station, codenamed JM Wave, agents were coordinating with exile militias. Declassified CIA field memos showed JM Wave controlled over 400 operatives and bankrolled exile raids using off-the-books funds, funneled through fake corporations and Miami banks. It was a full-blown domestic war room, posing as a university research building on the University of Miami's campus. So this wasn't some rogue op in the jungle. This was an unofficial US territory, an army in waiting. And when the invasion failed, everything changed. All those promises vanished. The funding dried up. The weapons stopped. And the men who risked their lives felt abandoned. Some walked away, but others, they turned inward, built their own militias, made new alliances, and started planning their own operations against Cuba and against the people they felt betrayed them. Some of those alliances would resurface in darker chapters of US history, chapters involving bullets, back channels, and a motorcade in Dallas. But it started here, in a city built on dreams of going home, a city that became a Cold War within the Cold War. The CIA lost the beach, but the blowback? That detonated in Florida. And the ripple effect didn't just reshape Latin America, it redrew the battle lines at home. The invasion failed. The world knew it, and so did the men left behind. Over 1,100 fighters were captured. Most were beaten, all were interrogated, and every single one became part of a public humiliation campaign broadcast around the globe. Fidel Castro didn't just win militarily, he won with the narrative. He paraded the captured exiles in front of cameras. He used them as living proof of American imperialism and mocked the US for its lies. JFK stood in front of the press and took the hit. Sort of. He admitted sole responsibility, but downplayed the scale. He called the mission well-intentioned. He praised the bravery of the fighters. But behind the scenes, it was damage control. He didn't offer asylum. He didn't call for military extraction. He didn't meet with the families. What he did do was cut a deal. Over the course of nearly 2 years, the Kennedy administration negotiated with Castro in secret through intermediaries, and eventually they reached a number: $53 million in food, in baby formula, in medicine. Not in justice, not in accountability, but in what Castro needed to prop up his economy. To the world, it was spun as a diplomatic win. Kennedy saved the prisoners without firing another shot. No blood, no scandal, no exposure. But to the men who came home, it was betrayal. Pepe San Roman, commander of Brigade 2506, never forgave him. He called it a political ransom, a way for Kennedy to buy headlines and bury guilt. Ernesto Oliva, his second in command, called it what it was: a deal with a dictator, nothing more. And when they arrived back in Miami, worn, starved, traumatized, there was no parade, just silence. In the eyes of the survivors, Kennedy didn't save them, he bought their silence. The invasion was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Fidel Castro didn't see the Bay of Pigs as a fluke, he saw it as a preview. Because if the United States was willing to fund, arm, and abandon an entire invasion force, what would stop them from trying again? He knew he couldn't beat the US alone, so he stopped trying. Instead, he made it official. He reached out to the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev answered. What started as quiet support, advisors, rifles, intel, quickly turned into something else: Soviet military infrastructure, missile defenses, long-range capability. By late 1961, SAM sites, surface-to-air missiles, were being installed across Cuba. Then came the shipments: long crates, sealed manifests, transported by Soviet ships and unloaded at night. And then came the photos. In October 1962, a U-2 spy plane snapped high-altitude images over the island. What it saw changed the world. Nuclear missile installations, silos, launch platforms, all aimed at the continental United States, all just 90 miles off the Florida coast. Kennedy was stunned, and on Oval Office tapes, tapes never meant for the public, you can hear it. The frustration, the regret, the quiet realization that his failed invasion hadn't stopped a war, it had provoked one. It didn't destabilize Castro, it pushed him deeper into Soviet arms. It gave Khrushchev the excuse he needed to test the young president's resolve. And it put the world on a 13-day countdown to annihilation. The Bay of Pigs wasn't the end of a conflict, it was the fuse. The botched invasion didn't prevent a war, it invited one. So let's stop here, because this is the part most people either ignore or try too hard to explain away. What if the Bay of Pigs wasn't just a failure? What if it was a setup? Remember, the CIA under Allen Dulles had become a shadow government, toppled Iran in '53, overthrew Guatemala in '54, staged assassinations, rigged elections, trained militias, and they did it without asking permission. Then along comes Kennedy, elected, but untested. He doesn't trust them. They don't respect him. And the Bay of Pigs becomes the friction point. Some insiders claimed years later that the CIA deliberately withheld details from Kennedy, that they sandbagged the plan, knowing he'd take the blame when it imploded. But here's where it gets even stranger. There's another theory, the inverse. What if Kennedy let it fail? Not because he was weak, but because he was playing the long game. What if he saw the op for what it really was? A reckless, deniable CIA fantasy, and knew the only way to dismantle it was to let it fall apart in the open. He could fire the architects. He could reclaim control of covert operations. He could rebuild the system from the ground up. In this version of the story, Kennedy didn't fumble the plan, he exposed it. Both theories have receipts, but neither is as explosive as what came next, Operation Northwoods. A top secret proposal drafted less than a year after the invasion, signed off by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, backed by key figures in military intelligence, and buried for decades. It proposed staging fake terror attacks on American soil, blowing up a US ship, hijacking a plane, even launching false flag shootings in US cities, and blaming it all on Cuba. And why? To justify a full-scale military invasion. The document was declassified in 1997. It's not a theory, it's not a fringe rumor, it's real. You can read it. I made a video on it that you can find below. The plan was never approved because Kennedy shut it down, but it shows how far the intelligence machine was willing to go and how badly they wanted Cuba off the map. The CIA's own Inspector General report from 1961 admitted the Bay of Pigs was riddled with lies, bad planning, and political manipulation. Allen Dulles, after being fired, he didn't disappear. He stayed in Washington, met with power brokers, and later, somehow, ended up on the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's death. Now, we're not saying the CIA killed Kennedy, but we are saying the tension was real, the motives were real, and the patterns unmistakable. Either way, someone was using dead men to rewrite the playbook. After the Bay of Pigs collapsed, Kennedy didn't rage. He didn't go public. He didn't start a purge. He waited. Then he made his move. First, he fired the architects. Allen Dulles, the CIA director who ran coups like chess games, gone. Richard Bissell, the brains behind the Bay of Pigs op, gone. General Charles Cabell, the deputy director, gone. In public, it looked like damage control, but behind the scenes, it was a declaration of war. Because Kennedy wasn't just angry, he was done. And so, he started dismantling their power. In late 1961, he issued NSAM 55, 56, and 57, three national security action memorandums that almost no one talks about. Together, they did something radical. They took control of covert military operations away from the CIA and gave it to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. From now on, the CIA wouldn't just launch Black Ops on its own. They'd have to go through the military, through civilian oversight, through him. It was a bureaucratic kill shot, and the intelligence community felt it. Allen Dulles may have been fired, but he still had allies, deep ones, in the Pentagon, in the press, in places Kennedy couldn't reach. Robert McNamara, JFK's Secretary of Defense, would later say that after the Bay of Pigs, the president began to see how deep the machinery ran and how little of it actually answered to him. Arthur Schlesinger, one of Kennedy's closest advisors, said the moment changed him, that JFK began to understand the price of power and how hard it would be to control the men behind the curtain. And here's the twist. After the Bay of Pigs, JFK began to pull back from aggressive Cold War expansion. He started questioning US involvement in Vietnam, questioning the arms race, questioning the very foundation of American empire building. And that made him dangerous. Because to the system that had built its power on secrecy, proxy wars, and unchecked operations, Kennedy wasn't just a liability, he was a threat. Some say this was the moment Kennedy stopped being a president and became the liability. By the end of 1962, Kennedy had done something few presidents ever do. He made enemies inside his own government. Not just political opponents, powerful enemies, the kind who don't run for office, the kind who don't answer to voters. The Bay of Pigs didn't just humiliate the United States, it shattered the trust between Kennedy and the intelligence world. And it created a fracture, one that never healed. Many believed he had personally betrayed them, that he'd left their brothers to die, that he'd used their pain for political cover. And some of them didn't just hold a grudge, they found allies. Because inside the intelligence community, especially the parts Kennedy tried to gut, his name was becoming something else, a problem. And that grudge, it didn't just fester in Miami. Some of the men trained for the Bay of Pigs, men recruited, armed, and deployed by the CIA, didn't disappear after the invasion. They were recycled. Brigade 2506 veterans were quietly funneled into new black ops across Latin America. Others were absorbed into anti-Castro hit squads operating in the US, and some were later flagged in FBI and HSCA investigations into plots against Kennedy. Then there's E. Howard Hunt, a Bay of Pigs planner, a longtime CIA operative, and a man who, just before his death, left behind a recorded confession. On tape, Hunt describes a plan, not a theory, a plot, one to kill Kennedy, involving rogue CIA assets and Cuban exiles, the very same groups that once stormed the beach at Hidong. He named the names, and when asked where it began, he didn't say Dallas, he said Miami. And then November 22nd, 1963, Dallas. The official story is simple. Lee Harvey Oswald, lone gunman, end of story. But here's the part most people don't realize. Oswald had ties. Ties to men like David Ferrie and Guy Bannister, both of whom had deep connections to Cuban exile networks, right-wing paramilitary circles, and people who'd been involved in the very same Miami operations that trained the men for the Bay of Pigs. Oswald handed out pro-Castro leaflets from a building that also housed anti-Castro operatives. He claimed to support Cuba while circling people who wanted it burned to the ground. It didn't make sense, and it still doesn't. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, decades later, called it what it was, a conspiracy, not a lone gunman, a network. The Church Committee confirmed that the CIA withheld information from the Warren Commission, that multiple intelligence officers had contacts with Oswald, that there were tapes, memos, entire folders that disappeared. And then there's this. The man Kennedy fired, Allen Dulles, the architect of the Bay of Pigs, the man he blamed for everything, was quietly appointed to the Warren Commission to investigate the very death of the man who stripped him of power. You can't make this up. And that's not speculation, that's a matter of record. This isn't about proving a theory, it's about recognizing a pattern. The fallout from the Bay of Pigs created enemies, deep ones, connected ones, and some of them never stopped moving. The men he abandoned in Cuba may have followed him to Dallas. Let's separate the receipts from the rumors. So, first, here's what's confirmed: the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. The CIA misled the president. Internal memos show they expected him to escalate the mission once it started, and he didn't, and it collapsed. Alan Dulles, Richard Bissell, and Charles Cabell were fired. Operation Northwoods was drafted less than a year later, proposing staged attacks on Americans to justify war with Cuba. The US and the USSR came closer to nuclear war than at any point in history during the fallout. None of that speculation. That's in the documents. You can read it yourself. And here's what still lives in the shadows. Did the CIA intentionally rig the mission to fail and break the president's back? Did Kennedy let it fail to expose the agency and reclaim control? Did anti-Castro Cuban exiles, trained and abandoned in the Bay of Pigs, become assets in later plots, maybe even Dallas? And how, after being fired, did Alan Dulles end up investigating the man who fired him? Those aren't just crazy questions, they're legitimate fractures in the timeline. They are patterns: repeated names, overlapping networks, missing documents, vanishing tape, testimony that doesn't match the memo. Because if history is being edited in real time, someone needs to keep the original draft. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just an operation, it was a fire line between what they told us and what actually happened next. They called it a training exercise. They called it a humanitarian effort. But to the men on the beach, it was betrayal, wrapped in a flag. Most of them were kids, exiles, raised on promises, told they were fighting for freedom, for their country, for democracy. And they believed it. And many of them died for it. The ones who survived came home to nothing: no medals, no apologies, just a government that stopped answering their calls. Their names became a whisper, their story a sentence in a textbook, a cautionary tale buried under the myths we liked better. But Kennedy? He didn't fall with them. He rose. His approval numbers climbed. His speeches sharpened. And Camelot was born. But every myth needs a monster, and the CIA played that part. They got the blame, Kennedy got the spotlight. And the truth? The truth got sealed behind closed doors and redacted with black ink. But something cracked after he'd owned, and it never uncracked. Because the Bay of Pigs wasn't just a failure, it was a prototype, a proof of concept for what came next. Plausible deniability, secret wars, shadow policy. The age of clean suits, dirty hands, and smiling press conferences, while the real decisions were made in back rooms and black sites. It didn't end on that beach. It started there. In Hidong, American foreign policy learned how to disappear itself, how to hide the hands and control the camera. And we've been trying to unsee it ever since. So they cleaned the blood off the beach, but never off the legacy. This one took time, not just to write, but to make sure we told it right. Because some stories aren't about who was right or wrong, they're about who got left behind. So now, until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, no matter what they tell you, the truth is still out there. These investigations are powered by those who believe truth still matters. Thank you to our Patreon supporters. Join the mission at patreon.com/divergentfiles.